Obvious from the introductions that we're going to be talking about a lot of different forms of violence, definitely police violence and state violence, and we also need to talk about community violence and interpersonal violence and how we deal with that within our own communities and with our own organizations. So to kind of get into the issue a bit more, I want to ask all the speakers to speak a bit more about within your communities or within the scope of your work, what are the different manifestations of violence at these different levels of interpersonal, community, or state level? What does it look like? What are the issues that you're dealing with? And what role do you see the government or the state in playing in either preventing, promoting, instigating, or participating in this violence? And I encourage you all to give examples, concrete examples if possible. So I don't know if you want to start at the end again there, Ellen, but we don't have to go in order. Also, if there's somebody else who wants to speak first, don't hesitate.
I feel kind of crunched with here, and I'm used to standing when I do presentations. You can't really look at what's happening in regards to gender and police violence or violence in general without looking at the historical context and the reasons why these things are happening. If we start with the Indian Act was designed to undermine the role of women. So they took away our cultural heritage in the sense that they created a status of who's a real Indian, and then they created the fact that only the status could be passed to the children by the men. And in our culture, that heritage is passed on by the women. The language, the clans, everything about the values and the customs of our people. So we start with that kind of historical context and then move on. And that when a woman, an Indian woman, a native woman, whatever, she was no longer to live in her community when she married a non-native man. And so that breaking of the family structure and the support that that woman had when she started raising her own family, that was broken. Even when she divorced, she was not allowed to move back. And so we know, even now in 2010, that Aboriginal women, Indigenous women, are doubly marginalized. One, for being a woman, and second, for being an Indigenous woman. And so the state has created the situation that we see ourselves in. Women are the title holders to the land, and yet band councils are predominantly male. But if I look at what is happening today in regards to the murdered and missing Aboriginal women, the research has shown that there's over 520 murdered and missing Aboriginal women across Canada since 1980. There are some cases from the 60s and 70s, but there's not enough data that we can make a fair assumption of the rate. 24 of the cases of missing women and girls, 67 are cases of murder. The majority of cases are in the western provinces of Canada. 52% of the cases involve women and girls under the age of 30 years old. And if we look at one of the most famous cases, for those of you who are not aware of this issue, Helen Betty Osborne was a young woman who wanted to be a teacher. And she was in Winnipeg. And she was viciously killed by 6 men. And the RCMP knew who the murderers were. The community, the whole town knew who the murderers were. And nothing was done. And I'll read you a quote from Amnesty International's report, An Update of Stolen Sisters. The men who abducted her were driven by vicious stereotypes born of ignorance and aggression. They believed that young Aboriginal women were objects with no human value beyond sexual gratification. And that's the state that we're in 2010. We are under an archaic law that is not based upon human rights, but is based upon control of a particular, targeting a particular population. We are not from Asia. We are Indigenous. to this land, and yet we are denied our human rights. We see our Mother Earth being violated on a daily basis. And there was a young man that spoke on December 6th here for the, I think it was, again, the 20th anniversary of the Polytechnique murders. And he said, we treat women the way we are treating Mother Earth, with no care of the consequences, with no care of what the impact it will be for future generations. And it's true. I was a young child when the feminist revolution started happening, and women were trying to get equal rights. And we look today in 2010, feminism is a dirty word for all young women, and it shouldn't be. Because equality has not been reached. Whether you're an Aboriginal woman, whether you're a Quebecois, whether you're an immigrant woman. And today's society is predominantly men. If you look at the United Nations, when the leaders get together, how many women do you see as the leaders of their states? So I could say more, but I'll end it to give other panelists a chance to speak. Thank you.
Trying to separate the system, but you know. Thank you, Ellen. I think it's really good that I'm sitting beside you because you bring all the foundations that we're talking about on. In regards to the way that the state manifests violence and police brutality on the overarching issues that we are working on, as a so-called North America-wide network, and I say so-called because that is how we have to identify so people know that we are overreaching the so-called borders. And coming from a community where I still will never identify as Canadian or American or having been born with dual citizenship, what that means is that it's the battleground in which we're playing out this state-imposed violence has often been not only on Mother Earth, but on women's bodies themselves. Women's bodies have been the battleground for politics, for policing, for criminalization, and it always really bothers me when I hear people say things like, Canada is not as bad as the United States. We don't have as many ridiculous things that are going on there, particularly in regards to the criminalization. That is a matter of perspective, and that is a matter of who you're talking about and when. And I think we need to establish that wherever you have colonization, why is the question who has it worse and who is being more brutalized or who has more fodder going on in their police system? For me, it's a question of the effects of colonization, but the intergenerational effects as they play out on young people today. We are often having to justify the way that we respond to police and state-imposed violence as a youth organization because we aren't taken seriously. And because we refuse to be defined solely by the disease control context of sexual health and the pregnancy to so-called life term of reproductive health, it means for us that we receive a lot of the violence in our own communities, in our own backyard, in our own systems that say that they support us or say that they are in allyship with us. And I think that we see this manifest in so many different ways. If I think about, as a national organization, we have to have a lens in different places, but as an Indigenous woman, I know I'm going to care about it no matter where it's going on. I'm not going to think to myself, oh, that's a BC issue, or that's an Alberta issue, or that's a US issue. I remember earlier this year when I heard about the sentencing that ex-judge David Ramsey, who is, some people might be familiar with, he was 64 years old. He was forcing young Aboriginal girls to have sex with them in exchange for reduced sentencing or some kind of hope that they wouldn't be put on trial. And I remember earlier this year when his sentencing was given that I didn't hear from any other young Aboriginal women what they thought about that. And that the experts that they were going to were in institutions and were people who were not young people themselves. And so I think it's particularly important when we think about state-imposed violence that we are selling ourselves short on the parameters in which we're supposed to engage in this type of dialogue and the actions in which we organize. And it is not only about resisting the state, it is about taking a good reflection on the ways that we're acting in our own communities and the ways that we think that our allies, quote unquote, support us. And I see that in my own community with the Canadian Border Services Agency. There are many of our own people who are border agents, who are police officers, who work in these institutions for a variety of reasons. And I don't not think of them as my family or as my community members, but I have to apply that human lens in order to go back to my community at night and sleep at night, really. I also thought about earlier this year, and it's really relevant now with the Olympics going on, the elder from the Squamish Nation, Harriet Nahani, who was arrested for protesting against condominium development around the Squamish Nation. 72 years old, put in jail for 14 days, contracted pneumonia, and subsequently died a week later. And I think about our responsibility as young people today in the absence of youth being present or youth being involved in that situation that one of our elders had to die at this age. And so all of these things really manifest for me when I think about the impositions that we're facing, but the different ways that I don't want to just protest the system or the state. I want to take a good look at what we're doing about that and the different ways that we need to organize around that.